Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the first session of our Extended Producer Responsibility webcast series. I am Monica Kondumani, part of PwC Switzerland, and I do lead the global sustainable supply chain efforts for our tax and legal services. Today, we are hosting our first session of series of three. In the next 45 minutes, we would like to give you an introduction to the key concepts that you should be aware of with respect to EPR, and you will be able to take away an understanding of how this can impact your business. In the upcoming sessions, we will delve even deeper into the topic and the different aspects of EPR, and will provide you with relevant information and registration instructions afterwards by email. Just some housekeeping before we start. This session is recorded. The recording and the slides will be made available later this week. If you have any questions, please submit those via the Q&A or the chat function that you can see, and your questions will be addressed. If you provide your question anonymously and we cannot cover it in this session, we will not be able to get back to you as it is truly anonymous. However, if you put your name, then we can contact you afterwards just in case we are not able to get back to you during this session. And we then can contact you separately as well. Any questions, please always reach out to any one of us or to your local contact. I am joined today by my colleagues across the PwC network who will be taking you through this topic of EPR. Would like to introduce you to Claudia from our Customs and International Trade Practice. She's part of the Sustainable Supply Chain team based in the Netherlands, and she will demystify some of the concepts that you might have heard around these words. Ismail leads our global sustainability legal area, and he will be taking us through the actual rules, the concepts, why are they there, and as well give us the introduction around all the legal thinking behind it. Dan from the environmental tax practice in the UK will show us a practical case of a pharma multinational company together with Claudia. And lastly, we will have a panel discussion with two colleagues from our sustainability platform practice in our advisory teams who will take us through the practical elements. How do you go about this? And in the end, we also have some Q&A. So if you have any questions, please feel free to post them as discussed earlier. With that, Claudia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Monica, for the brilliant introduction. Now diving a bit into EPR already. EPR law aims to make producers of certain items responsible for those items throughout their life cycles. That means that the producer's responsibility does not stop when they bring it to the market, but it's actually extended. So that means up from as of the moment that it's brought into or onto the market, up to the reuse, recycling, or when it becomes waste. Because the aim of the EPR, the extended producer responsibility, is to adopt more sustainable practices, reduced waste generation, and promote the development of recycling and recovery infrastructure. An example, for instance, is setting an eco-design standard that producers must consider when making a product, and making sure that the treatment of end of life products is taken into account as well. Of course, the EU always considers, and I think a lot of authorities always hope that companies are doing it by themselves, but unfortunately then the government has the feeling that it's not going rapidly enough. And that means that the EPR is providing a legal framework that brings obligations to producers. And the question that always pops up is then, who is a producer? Because that seems, if you just look at the word, that is someone that actually produced the product, but that would be too easy. So to avoid that, people that make profit or companies that make profit by bringing products in on the market are all covered. So producers should be read or considered as also the company that is selling, importing, or really manufacturing, producing the products. That producer need to report all kind of detailed data on the product. In some case, pay fees or are obliged to make sure that there will be reuse or recycling within their territory. So then if we go to the next slide, what is important is that the extended producer responsibility is not always considered a tax, even though we are here from Tax, Legal and People, from PwC. It is also not always considered legal. There are a lot of functions, groups within a company that are confronted with the impact of EPR and how certain countries implement it. So for instance, you can have finance and tax that are responsible for the compliance and the actual payment of fees. If you have to report on the composition of your product, normally it's procurement that has the relation with the supplier. So that is why they are involved. Legal normally is the first department where a company is looking at on what is coming towards us and what do we need to do. The research and development department, if they would not take into account that you have, for instance, certain products that are less, that are better for our environment, it would of course be really helpful if R&D is already taking that into consideration. And then the sustainability team is really focused on what are we actually doing, how can we put it in our sustainability report, and what is happening. So it's important that every function within the organization is aware of what is coming and how to deal with it. So if we then look at the next slide, you can see that we are going, the zoom in is clear. We are going to discuss the EPR and the plastics mainly. Nevertheless, what is important is that there's a lot more coming to you. And that is part of it is coming from the Green Deal that the EU launched. And there, for instance, we have the CBAM legislation. ETS is already there for a long period, mainly looking both levies, taxes, that mainly look at the carbon embedded in certain products. But as you can see here, there's a lot of other information and legislation that is coming to you, a lot of obligations that you have to fulfill if you want to bring products onto this market. But this webinar is really focused on EPR and the plastic packaging tax. And if we talk about then if we go to the next slide, what you see is that when we talk about EPR and plastics, here you can see that there are differences across Europe. One of them, for instance, is the UK. They left the EU, but they were the first one actually introducing the plastic tax. So they were best of class, even though they left the class, to say it like that. It's not identical to the legislation in Spain. And for instance, if you look at the Netherlands, it's not called a plastic tax, but you have to pay almost on the same data a voluntary fee to an independent authority for bringing plastics onto the market. So what you see in general, when it comes to EPR and plastics, is that there are a lot of departments within a company involved. It differs per country at the moment within Europe, so there's not one size fits all. And also EPR and plastic are not the only topics that you have to consider within your supply chain. So now I'm going to hand it over to Ismael, who is going to discuss the details of EPR with you.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It is not easy to summarize all the EPR aspects from a regulatory perspective because there are many regulations for different products in different countries, as we have just seen. But I would like to highlight some common features that are present, I would say, in all or almost all EPR regimes. The first idea I would like to stress is that the EPR is a regulatory tool. It is a set of regulations. It's a bunch of obligations or requirements that fall on the producer of a product. It is not a tax, although some might get confused because EPR typically involves contributing to an organization with a fee. We will come back on that shortly. And EPR is not a standard, it's not voluntary, it is mandatory, and it is hard law, and it may entail legal liabilities if a company does not comply with the EPR obligations. EPR is a regulatory tool that inscribes itself within circular economy and waste policy. The EPR aims at enhancing circular economy, at reducing the impact of the production of goods, at reducing pressure on natural resources, and also it aims at ensuring a proper waste management when the product reaches the end of its life and it becomes waste. This brings me to the second idea I would like to highlight. We could say that the EPR has two main goals. One of them, we just said it, is improving circularity and ensuring a correct waste management. The second one, which starts maybe shedding some light on how the EPR actually works, is the implementation of the polluter pays principle. Polluter pays principle is a basic principle in environmental legislation, and the EPR, as we have seen, makes the producer responsible for the environmental impacts of the product. And it makes the producer responsible for all the impacts throughout the product's life cycle, including the waste phase. As it has been said, importantly, the producer is not always the manufacturer. Typically, under the EPR regulations, the producer is the company that places a product in the market. And what does it mean in practice that the producer is responsible for the product even at the end of its life, when it becomes waste? Well, it means that the producer has to bear on him all the costs of managing that waste. We will now see in a minute how this is done in practice, but let me underline that the producer has to cover all the costs of collecting the waste, transporting it to waste management facilities, and making sure that the waste is given the right treatment, so it's properly managed, which means preparing it for reuse, which may mean recycling that waste, which may mean incinerating it or disposing it in a landfill. This brings me also to the common obligations that we may find under all or almost all EPR regime. We have already mentioned those obligations falling on the producer to address the organizational and financial obligations to ensure a proper management of the waste. Those obligations dealing with collection, transport, and waste treatment. But usually we also find obligations to register in a public registry under the administration of a competent authority and reporting through that registry the amount of goods, the amount of products subject to the EPR that each producer is placing on the market. This type of registry is a basic tool for the implementation of the EPR, and it's important also for the administration to ensure compliance with the EPR obligations. It is not always evident, it is not always easy to report under those registries, and in Spain we have experience in assisting some clients in complying with these obligations, for example with packaging. It's important to understand what has to be reported and how it has to be reported, and under which categories, how the reporting has to be done. Apart from these obligations, in many EPR regulations, we can find some specific requirements that go beyond the minimum content of an EPR regime. In this regard, we can find eco-design requirements, like obligations, for example, to make products easier to repair. We find that, for example, with electric and electronic equipment, or make those products more easily recyclable, or made them with more recycled content, as we find, for example, with packaging. We may have also due diligence obligations, as we have, for example, with the new EU batteries regulation, where the producer has to identify and mitigate environmental impacts of batteries across the value chain. We also have some rules on waste prevention and reuse obligations. For example, again, packaging is a good example, with measures to prevent over packaging or to increase the use of reusable packaging. And finally, we may find also obligations on producers to raise awareness, like, for example, by conducting campaigns to educate the consumer on the environmental impacts of products, or on how they can or even they must contribute to improving waste management. Next slide, please. When it comes to the implementation, compliance with EPR obligations, we have to bear in mind, first of all, that we must give a look to the specific legislation that applies to each individual product in each individual countries. There are common features for EPR, as we have seen, but the specific obligations will depend on the individual regulations addressing each product, each waste flow in each jurisdiction. So let's make sure that we are aware of what legislation actually applies in each case. And furthermore, let's also bear in mind that this is quite an evolving landscape, with new regulations being adopted very, very often. To give you an example, we conducted a project in Spain for a company looking at developing an electric vehicle batteries recycling facility in Iberia, and we had to look at the existing EPR regulations for batteries, both in Spain and in Portugal. We looked also at the upcoming EU batteries regulation, and also at the EPR regulations for end-of-life vehicles. So the landscape is complex, and there are several aspects that have to be taken into account. Second aspect I would like to highlight on this slide, and this is really important. We have seen that the obligations fall on the producer. The producer can definitely decide to address those obligations individually, but more often producers rely on the so-called collective systems or producer organizations. The EPR regulations typically allow for producers to create or join organizations to take care of the EPR obligations. Normally, the producers adhere those organizations, they sign a contract with those organizations, and they become obliged to report to them the amount of products that they place on the market, and they become obliged also to contribute to the organization with a fee, which will help covering the cost of collecting, transporting, and treating the waste. Producers have obligations vis-a-vis those organizations, but also rights. And this is normally regulated as well in the EPR regulations. As part of our practice in Spain, we are we're assessing some of these organizations, for example, on how to comply with the new changing regulations, like, for example, on commercial packaging. So it's also important that these organizations are properly created and comply correctly with their obligations. A couple of additional comments here as well. Often EPR regulations may establish targets, like separate collection targets or recycling targets, and leave producers some room to decide on how to reach those targets, which measures to implement to ensure that they can fulfill those objectives. But sometimes the EPR regulations oblige producers to implement specific measures, and we have to be aware of that as well. And a good example, again, with packaging can be the implementation, the obligation to implement, in some cases, deposit and return schemes to ensure that packaging is properly recovered and can be properly recycled or reused. And last comment here, I insist, EPR is a regulatory tool, so it is mandatory. It's not a voluntary scheme. So non-compliance brings liabilities, typically fines, but it may also entail banning certain products, not being able of placing those products on the market. Next slide, please. This is the last slides, and just 3 ideas here. First, I would like to mention that we have a number of regulatory developments on EPR which are being developed in the EU. We have a number of directives and regulations already in place, and new regulations which are being negotiated. For example, we have the revision of the Waste Framework Directive to introduce the EPR for the textile sector. The EPR for the textile sector already exists in countries like France or Sweden, the Netherlands. It's being also implemented in Spain, but we will have a common framework now at the EU level. We have under negotiation a new packaging regulation, a new regulation on vehicles at the end of the life. There is an initiative to review the directive on electric and electronic equipment. So a number of initiatives ongoing that we have pay attention to. And it's also important to highlight that EPR has been intensively implemented in the EU, but we also see EPR emerging regimes in countries in Latin America, for example, in Asia, in some states in the United States, etc. So it's becoming really a global trend to address waste and circular economy. Second aspect I would like to stress in this slide is that we see perhaps a trend in the EU to move from directives which require transposition by member states to regulations. And clearly the EU is looking to get a higher harmonization. And this is, I guess, normal because EPR has a relevant impact on the internal market. So we are moving from directives to regulations, a more harmonized EU-wide approach for different products and different waste flows. And finally, last but not least, and I want to underline this again, we must not see EPR in isolation. We have started by saying that the EPR is part of circular economy policies, and as such, it is connected with many other regulations, like the eco-design regulations, other waste measures, like waste shipment regulations or regulations on landfills. There are connections with the EPR regulations that address specific waste flows. And as it has been mentioned, there is a link also with emerging taxes, like the tax on single-use plastic packaging in Spain or in the UK, etc. So there are a bunch of regulations that are interconnected and linked with EPR obligations, with EPR regulations, and we have to bear in mind also that we have to see the full picture of waste and circular economy regulations to have a good understanding on how our products are affected. Thank you. I'll leave it here and I pass it now to the next speaker. Dan, please.
Thank you, Ismail. A quick introduction. I'm Dan. As introduced, part of the environmental taxes team, and Claudio and I will be talking you through some of the work we've done for a client of ours recently. Now, as mentioned, environmental taxes and regulations are aimed at influencing behavior to further environmental aims and to raise revenue. Now, sometimes these fund environmental purposes or initiatives.
Different governments take different strategies, which can add to the challenges for business because the majority of you are operating internationally. As such, you will have to get your head around several different regimes and how they interact with each other.
And that's kind of where we help, and we're going to take you through an example. Now, our client, a pharma multinational, came to us in seeking assistance to understand and navigate its way through both EPR and PPT. Now, EPR is, as Ismail and Claudia mentioned before, it's different across the EU. Plastic packaging tax has only been introduced in 2 countries, that's the UK and Spain. However, even both of their introductions and implementations of the tax are different, although there are similarities. Now, the 2 interlinked pieces of regulatory legislation, EPR and PPT, are active in multiple jurisdictions, and this is what we are unprepared for. Now, the first step in our assistance is to understand what the current state was, what data and systems regarding packaging and waste existed. Now, what were the gaps, and what were we matching up to what the business needs to do in respect of EPR, and that could be waste management and reporting, and for PPT, which is reporting on plastic packaging being imported or sold in the market. Now, the biggest issue, as mentioned, is the multi-jurisdictions, 2 taxes across the EU, so Spain and the UK, and then EPR across the EU. But here we turned the issue into something we thought could help us. Now, for regulation across multiple countries, we thought, what were the commonalities, the synergies? Sometimes for EPR and PPT, there are common data elements and themes, and we can leverage or use some work done in one market for another. And an example of that was some of the work done in the UK. As mentioned, it was an early adopter of plastic packaging tax, can be used in Spain. Now, the key kind of, I guess, characteristic here is we need to ensure that the legal function is involved, because they identify what areas of the law will apply to the business.
So then, do I understand correctly that where the data requirements are the same across the different taxes, that the reporting on different packaging elements could exist, and how do you overcome this?
No, that's right, Claudia. So one of the areas that we identified was that all packaging needs to be reported. Now, whether that's for plastic, as in plastic packaging tax in the UK and Spain, or waste packaging and obligations for EPR in the EU. Now, EPR has been around for a little longer, and therefore it allows businesses such as ours to have a database of the different types of packaging and waste that they use or they produce. Now, we could split this across the impacted jurisdictions, and we also realized that it wouldn't have to sit with one team.
Okay, so am I then right that what we discussed in the beginning, that also in this case, it was really important to identify the right teams that needed to be involved?
Yes, you're right, Claudia. So we have procurement to ensure that supplies are being provided to the right, I guess, to the right customers. Supply chain are identifying the movement of the goods. IT is very key because they control all of the data, and you've got customs where you've got goods coming in and out of the country, brokers are involved, and the goods need to be declared. Now, we engaged with the key stakeholders who are responsible, and all of them are affected by plastic packaging tax or EPR. And I think you highlighted them earlier in your slides. Now, through our experience, we know that it doesn't sit with this one function. However, they need to be involved in the implementation and communication of a strategy. Now, this can be through project managing or gathering the key data throughout the process. Now, as I mentioned earlier, an important part of the project is working with legal and regulatory teams to ensure that the basis of the regulation and how it applies to each product is correctly identified. As we have a pharma business, for the UK and Spain, in respect of plastic packaging, exemptions exist, and therefore it is very important to know which products are exempt from the tax and which are included. And that's where the regulatory and legal teams play their part. Now, as being a pharma company with the wide range of goods, it was very important that we look at it holistically and we look at it across Europe. Now, we looked at all of the products, including the type, the weight, and the recycled content of all packaging. Also, we looked at the quantity of products sold in different markets, be that Spain, be that the UK, Italy, and the exemptions and credits, as mentioned. Now, we use various sources and methods to validate this data. Now, EPR is a policy approach that requires producers to bear the financial responsibility of the waste management of their products, as Ishmael and Claudia mentioned. And we needed to ensure that any process that was implemented was accepting of the different directives for EPR schemes across the EU. Work was undertaken to ensure that the regulatory and legal teams were included, as well as procurement. Now, we also created a system to be able to report the obligations based on the rates and the rules and produce them in a required format. And how are they going to be reported? Now, we also ensured that the system was secure and a database was created and it was user-friendly so that the business was able to use it on a regular basis.
Okay, and because you had the finance team involved, as you described, you were able to ensure that this was all fed back into the business internal system for accounting and audit purposes?
That's right, Claudia. So one of the key themes across any project, and this project in particular, is to ensure consistency and alignment between the different business functions, because everybody within the business does get affected. And what we wanted to ensure that we were able to scale and adapt for markets that may produce or introduce similar taxes or regulation in the future. Now, one of the boxes we have here is horizon scanning, and that's key because as kind of we've been mentioning and as a key theme throughout this presentation is that looking into the future, new obligations and regulations will be coming in, and sometimes they come in and then they are removed because of maybe political issues or just changes in the economic landscape of I guess of what we're dealing with at the moment. Now, we know that certain obligations may be adopted by more than one country, and we can plan to introduce infrastructure to support it. This is what we did for the plastic packaging tax, where we leveraged UK work done into Spain. And this can also assist us in the future. Now, the data and systems created for the taxes were helpful in monitoring and improving the environmental performance of the business. And what we did is we created documentation and guidance for the business to use once our assistance kind of was finished. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. Now, some of the key issues we faced was that the EPR and PPT didn't sit with just one team or function, and that's very normal. But what we did end up having is we ensured that tax, legal, and regulatory teams were in the room driving the decisions, forming a multidisciplinary team across the business. Now, due to the ever-changing nature of regulation, there was no consistent approach. However, different business units were working independently in creating solutions. And what we did, we utilized horizon scanning, as we mentioned, and we were able to identify advancements ahead and ensure that data from across the business was being incorporated into a solution to future-proof our current work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan and Claudia, for this very interesting case. And we'll now go into the panel discussion with Federico and Ferdinand. There is just one question which I think we can get quickly out of the way. The question was, are B2B companies affected in the same way as B2C companies, or are producers only companies which deliver to an end customer? So, Ismail.
Sorry, you're addressing the question to me. I thought it was going to be Federico and Ferdinand who were going to discuss. No, but sure. I mean, the obligations may fall on both on B2B and B2C companies, and packaging is a good example. We have EPR regimes for domestic, for household packaging, but we have also EPR regimes for commercial and industrial, for professional packaging, which affect to B2B relationships.
Thank you. So the answer is to anonymous, yes, everyone is in scope, B2B and B2C. Exactly. And now, Ferdinand and Federico, the other question that came in is, Ismail mentioned the EPR collective system. Could you please comment a little bit, like when it comes to EPR from a strategic but also operational, point of view, what does it mean? And perhaps let's start with the EPR collective system.
I mean, I can maybe take this, Monica. Thanks for having me here on the panel. So I think what is really important and what is really also part of this webcast is that to understand that it's not possible anymore to see EPR as like a separate aspect of your business, just with the goal to comply, but it's really like becoming an integral part of your business, and it's increasingly multifunctional because it includes the tax issue, but it also covers like sustainability and eventually also strategy, because nowadays EPR is not only about like waste and packaging, but it's also about aspects of design. How do you design your products in the very beginning of your value chain? Because 80% of the environmental impacts are defined within the design stage. So it becomes really increasingly important to integrate this into your strategy and to understand how it goes into your business model. And that includes not only logistics and customs, but also maybe take back infrastructure for like the reuse part. And so you also have to understand your partners and your ecosystem. And in this way, I think it becomes more and more as part of the circular economy, part of your business model.
Thank you, Ferdinand. So if I understand correctly, EPR collective system means perhaps two things. One, you need to collaborate with other companies which are in your ecosystem, if I understand this correctly. On the one hand side, to find the proper solutions. No company can go this way alone. And the other thing is it's a multifunctional exercise, which every function in the company will be covered or included in this and is in the scope.
Yes, correctly. I mean, EPR is fundamentally about creating markets for circular services. So be it like waste management, be it secondary markets, be it like repair, like also Ismail mentioned. And most of these systems are collective systems. So to create these markets, it also requires to look beyond your own company and work with other actors in your supply chain, and also maybe with other competitors. Yes.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I hope this also addresses the question that just came in about the steel product. So the answer is everyone in the supply chain needs to deal with this. However, this is where you have the collectivity, you work together and try and find a solution together within your supply chain or value chain. Now, Federico, what are your experiences practically? What does this mean, and where do companies start?
Yeah, thanks, Monica. Good day, everybody. From my perspective, my personal experience has been in looking at some examples of how companies respond to EPR system. One interesting one was when I looked in the situation in Brazil with regards to the collection of agrochemicals. In 2002, the Brazilian parliament passed a law whereby all the companies producing agrochemicals were becoming responsible for the collection of the packaging, and they grouped together. As a consequence of that, all the producers of agrochemicals came together, and they founded a not-for-profit organization that over time has developed over 700 collection points and educating farmers. Now 95%, a whopping 95% of all packaging material in the agrochemicals is actually collected in Brazil. And so it's very successful, and it's called Campo Limpio because it keeps the fields clean, as the word says. not only that, but if we look at EPR, it's not just a burden, it creates opportunities. In fact, out of this initiative, there's a company that has now been set up, a for-profit organization that actually develops packaging materials using recycled material. And the technology keeps it's designed that it keeps the material clean and it's as good as the virgin materials. And so this goes to show that sometimes these are really can be looked at real opportunities. I think the key, Monica, to answer your question is that the starting point is to look at this from a multi-functional perspective inside a team, inside a company. It takes a community to address this, because I think we've mentioned that it's procurement, it's about design, product design, it's about developing the intellectual property. And ultimately it's also about engaging marketing. So all these different functions play a role in terms of finding a solution to some of the challenges that but turn into opportunities what the EPR is asking for.
But I presume this also means that, let's say, sometimes it's hard to bring everyone around the table. You can start as well smaller in various locations and try to work your way through it. Is this a fair statement?
I think the example that I looked at in Brazil, it was just initially it was just a bunch of three or four producers of agrochemicals companies trying to find a solution. So you're right, Monica. It's starting small. What is the problem at hand? Bringing collective minds together from multifunctions and trying to address those first, and then building on the opportunities as the understanding of the effects of the EPR become more clear. But this multifunctional approach and developing, knowing yourself first and what is your company's ambition, and then knowing who your partners are and when to engage them, it's going to be a fundamental in responding into the EPR requirements.
Right. Absolutely. And I think, Ferdinand, when you are looking at the types of projects that you are doing and working with companies in this area, what do you see where companies start first, or where do they put the focus on and spend the money in a first step?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and because you can very quickly get overwhelmed with EPR and all the regulations coming up. So usually we start with really like a screening, a regulatory screening for your specific enterprise and for the specific industry. And then it really becomes relevant which kind of EPR regulations you have to follow. And it's important to not get lost there. And it's really important to find a way to start. And usually, I mean, companies start with this regulatory screening with us, and then we go into these projects and try to develop like a step approach where you first understand your own firm, understand your own business context, and then go step by step outside of the firm and the partners and the broader ecosystem, and then start implementing them.
Thank you, Ferdinand. I just see another question around the formal criteria, or why between a fee, EPR fee, and a tax, and why should tax be involved? In my mind, the reason why tax should be involved is, even if it is not a tax, it has a lot of implications. As you can see on the screen, there are a lot of different elements that will have to take place in order to become compliant, starting with research and development. So the question then is, IP, are you creating new IP? Most likely, yes. Who pays for it? Where are your DEMP functions that control those IP functions? And also, your business model might be changed, might be impacted, transfer pricing through new types of business model that you might have. For instance, if we go into circularity, there are all sorts of other tax consequences that do come with it that will impact your business model and your transfer pricing. So I think tax needs to be at the table from the beginning to ensure that everything is done properly and in compliance, as well as not losing any opportunities that might come up, including, if this is the tax department in your company, taking care of subsidies or other incentives that might be available in that, as well as supporting the business if you go into joint ventures. As we spoke about the collaboration, the ecosystem around this will require joint venture contracts and to be entered into, and this then also requires some additional tax insight. Obviously, support from legal as well, regulatory, and then our friends from our advisory platforms. Right. So I think a lot of different inputs then will be required. I think this was the last question, and I also see that we're up on time. I do thank all of our presenters for your time. It was an excellent presentation. Thank you for everyone who has participated and listened in. We're very excited to welcome you at our second session on EPR, where we will delve into some more of the practical aspects of what this actually means, from systems and process through to actually doing strategy work and putting together a project within your company. So with that, I would like to wish you a great rest of the day, and keep safe, stay healthy. Take care.